So Ken Freedman is the station manager of WFMU. 13, 14 years? How long has it been? 25 years. I'm going to let him tell the story of FMU because he can obviously do it much better than I. Please give a fantastic Open Ed Vancouver welcome to Ken Freedman of WFMU.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks everybody for coming. I'm not sure why I've been invited to give the keynote speech. I'm not an education person, though I did manage to graduate college with some difficulty. But I'm a radio person, and the radio station that I've been managing for, I'm embarrassed to admit, 25 years, is WFMU, and it's classified as a non-commercial educational station. That's the FCC term, NCE. So maybe it makes a little bit of sense. But I do love radio ever since I was a little kid. And I especially these days love talk radio. When I'm not at WFMU itself, I'm usually just scanning the radio dial as I drive around, looking for the most psychotic talk radio I can possibly find. The crazier the host, the better I like it. And there was one talk show host in New York who's no longer on the air there named Lionel, who came from Florida. And one day he did something that I found quite amazing. He was aware that the people who called into his radio show often worked very hard writing out an entire script for themselves for what they were going to say when they managed to get on the air. And they would sit there hitting redial, redial until they finally get on the air. And what Lionel did one day is he got some guy on the air and he let the guy go on. If it was today, he might say, like, I'm tired of Obama trampling on my constitutional rights, and this healthcare system's a mess, and I'm outraged. And Lionel just said, okay, And then he let the guy just read his entire script. And then Lionel didn't say a word. And then the guy was on the air and basically just flapping in the breeze, saying, yeah, that's what I think. That's what I think, Lionel. You still there? And Lionel didn't say a word. He basically handed over the radio show to this one guy and his script. I do a talk show, a comedy talk show with a friend of mine named Andy Breckman called 7 Second Delay. And after I heard that show with Lionel, Andy and I had an idea that we would like to do a talk show where we took ourselves out of the equation altogether. We wanted to do a talk show where the two of us, the two hosts, did not talk at all. So Andy brought in a little Casio keyboard one day, and we just put a microphone on the Casio keyboard playing a repetitive melodic loop, and we just waited to see what would happen. We had been on the air for years. A lot of our regular listeners knew the call-in number. We just wanted to see if anybody would bother calling in if we didn't say a word. It took about 5 or 10 minutes, but finally people started calling in. And after a while, people started getting the idea that all they had to do was dial the on-air number, and they would be put right on the air, and they would be on the air themselves. There would be no moderation. There would be no interaction with the hosts whatsoever. We had literally turned the radio program over to the listeners altogether. And it was fun, but after about 30 minutes, we realized that there was a reason why we were on the air, and in general, they were not. A few years later, we decided that one try at what we called the radio chat room was not sufficient, and we actually gave it its own slot for an entire summer for 4 months, and that only reinforced the idea. But years later, somebody once asked me, when did WFMU get started doing social media? And I realized that the radio chat room, that one little silly experiment, probably was the beginning, because that was the first time where we kind of took the radio people out of the equation completely and turned over the radio program to the listeners themselves. What WFMU is pretty much an experimental radio station. It's got its backbone in pop music and punk rock. It's an independent, non-commercial, ex-college station. We used to be owned by Uppsala College in East Orange, New Jersey, which was a private Lutheran college that went bankrupt in 1994, and we were the only part of the college to survive the bankruptcy. We've been on the air since 1958. We went online in 1993. We started streaming in 1997. And we were one of the first stations to begin archiving all of our programs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. When podcasting began, we were one of the first stations in the world to begin podcasting. And when the iPhone came out, we actually had the first iPhone stream. And what we did with the iPhone stream was illustrative of what we do in general. We do something first, and then we do absolutely zero follow-up development on it until several years go by and we realize we have to play catch-up. So we had the first iPhone stream ever, but then we just last week launched our first iPhone app. But 2 years ago, WFMU crossed an important symbolic threshold where we realized that we suddenly had more people listening to the radio station online over the internet than over the FM signal. And that's with an FM signal in New York City, although it doesn't come in very well throughout all of New York City, but also with a repeater station in New York State in the Catskill Mountains. We saw the internet in the beginning really just as a delivery mechanism and as a survival mechanism, because in the early 1990s, the college that owned WFMU was clearly going down the tubes. They were clearly heading towards bankruptcy. And I saw the internet simply as a way to get our signal out and to improve our signal in the New York area. I didn't see it as changing the overall tenor of what we did. I didn't understand at the time that what the internet was providing was way more than a delivery mechanism for radio, but it was an entirely new form of media. WFMU fits into the community radio movement in the US and probably some similarities throughout Canada as well, organizationally, but it doesn't really fit in terms of our programming. If you compare WFMU's programming to the programming of other community college and public radio stations, there's very, very little similarity. I would say that in the US, most community radio stations probably have their heart in the 1960s and the early 1970s, and they're very, very obsessed with identity politics. And WFMU, I think, one of the best things that we did is we took ourselves off the air following the Woodstock Festival. It's actually a very funny story. Following Woodstock, the WFMU staff felt like it had been their idea, and the Woodstock Festival had been ripped off from them. So among other reasons, they walked out, and the station was off the air for approximately 10 months. It went back on the air sometime in 1970, and then I think the thing that probably saved the station and really led it to the way it is now is that what really breathed new life into it then was the punk and new wave movement in the mid to late 1970s. And that's probably one of the big differences, I think, between WFMU and other US community radio stations, is that our backbone probably came from the punk and experimental scene of the late 70s as opposed to the hippie movement of the 60s. But a lot of community and public radio stations look at WFMU as a huge success story. But if you knew about our internal and financial problems, then that should tell you more about the overall state of community and public radio than anything about us, because we're really struggling to survive, and we're waiting for that holy grail that will allow us to do what we need to do without compromising our philosophy. But we have managed to make the transition from being more or less a traditional media entity to an online entity, even if we didn't realize it at first. And we're succeeding in a lot of ways in making that transition, but we're falling short in other ways. And that's why I think that perhaps the best reason that I'm here is that my little radio station's experience might be illustrative of what other traditional media outlets are going through as they attempt to make the same transition. I've been saying at WFMU for a long time that the biggest problem we have right now is that we're too invested in being a radio station. And I often think that we would do a lot better if we stopped being a radio station altogether and focused just on this new powerful form of media, social media and online media that's all around us. But of course we can't do that, just as the New York Times can't stop being a newspaper because their base expects them to still be a printed form of media. And until very recently, my base at WFMU expected us to be a radio station, and many people do. But I did see the internet first as a delivery mechanism, and there was an experiment that happened in the late 1980s at WFMU that got me very excited about the internet as a delivery mechanism. One of our volunteers at WFMU was a fellow named Brian Redman, and he helped develop the video phone for Bell Labs in New Jersey. And then after that, they pretty much let him have carte blanche with any weird idea he had. And one of the things he did is he set up a division at Bellcore, what then became called Bellcore, for little WFMU audio experiments. So one of them was that you could call up and you could create your own legal station identification over the telephone using a keypad. He put together a WFMU wake-up call service, so you could use your telephone keypad and just program the telephone to call you at any time in the next 48 hours, and when you answered it, it would just be WFMU. And one of the things he did was he set up a very simple device so that 8 people at a time could call up and listen to WFMU over the telephone. And we didn't even think about that. We were aware that it was up for about a year and a half. But then when Belcor got wise to what was happening, and they pulled the plug on the entire, all of Brian's little projects, all of a sudden we started getting phone calls from people who were very upset that they could no longer listen to WFMU at work, on their company's dime, on the speakerphone at their desk. And that was when we realized, whoa, people who used to listen to WFMU over the radio have moved out of the area, and now they're listening to it over the telephone. And that really registered with me, but I didn't even know about the internet at that time. At that time, it was called ARPANET, and it was only a couple of years later that I realized that this thing called ARPANET was going to eventually allow people to transmit audio and radio and video in a similar way that we did with that little Belcor experiment. But the main thing I wanted to achieve with the internet was simply to help us with our poor FM coverage throughout the New York area, because we're licensed to cover Manhattan and we're licensed to cover most of Brooklyn, but because our signal is so weak and about 12 miles outside of the city, we've never managed to really achieve the coverage that the FCC is supposed to give us. But eventually in 1997, we started streaming, and immediately people started telling me that it wasn't radio, that this was just glorified CB radio, it was just a fad that was going to fade away after a couple of years. I had always been frustrated by the fact that when we wanted to tell people to listen to our station, we had to tell them our FM frequency, 91.1 FM. Because the chance that they would be able to tune in 91.1 FM and actually hear us was very low, because our signal was so weak throughout the New York area. So after we established that the streaming audience was there, that streaming was not, in fact, CB radio, glorified CB radio, and that it wasn't going to go away anytime soon, I started feeling like it was more important to emphasize WFMU.org than 91.1 FM, because the chance of somebody being able to go to WFMU.org and actually listen was far greater than somebody trying to tune in 91.1 FM. So at some point, we produced a hat, like the swag, the t-shirt that I'm wearing now. This is what fuels the engine that is WFMU, is just manufacturing tons and tons of crapola so that people keep making charitable donations to us. So we manufactured a hat that said WFMU.org, and it was the first time that we put out a piece of swag that didn't have the frequency. And I immediately got an incredibly nasty note back from a listener who said, I don't know what WFMU.org is, but it's not radio. And that was consistent with what a lot of people were saying. A lot of people were telling me that streaming was interesting, but it wasn't radio. But it soon became evident that, in fact, it was radio, and that the types of listeners and the types of contributors and the types of programmers that we were developing and that we were attracting back to the station through our stream were very much consistent with the kinds of programmers and listeners and donors that we had been attracting all along prior to streaming. But from the very early days of streaming, there was resistance and arguments about what this thing was, whether it was worth pursuing. But that was just the beginning. When we started archiving our programming 24 hours a day, the same thing happened. Suddenly, some of the staff at WFMU was very, very excited that all of our programming would now be available on demand. But a very common complaint that I got from our staff members was, wait a second, you're telling me that they can listen to somebody else's program while I'm on the air? I'm like, yeah, they can listen to whoever they want, or they can listen to your program after you're off the air. But a lot of the staff at WFMU had a big problem with the fact that I was forcing them to compete with their peers, that this was the beginning of the end of our little quasi-monopoly. And that really was the difference between online media and radio, is that radio stations and television stations and newspapers to a certain extent have enjoyed a local quasi-monopoly on the ability to get information or music or video or whatever out there. And the internet ends that quasi-monopoly. And from the beginning of our experiments with the internet at WFMU to the current day, this is still what I'm dealing with, the fact that people get into the radio head, not the band, but the radio mentality, and they have a lot of trouble dealing with the fact that we're no longer operating in the same paradigm that we were before. So after we started archiving, some people got bent out of shape. And people on the air, programmers at WFMU got bent out of shape, that it was no longer mandatory for people to listen to them, that if people didn't like their program, they could just listen to some other program. But it also became evident that the listeners loved the archiving, they loved being able to listen to all the programming on demand, and that despite the fact that it made it possible for people to listen to other programs other than the live program, the traffic that was still going to the live programming was still going on the increase. It was still increasing, even though we were giving people an option to listen to something other than the live programming. When we put together our first secondary channel, the same thing happened. It was during the Republican National Convention, I forget which year it was, when it was in New York City, and we decided to put together a 5-day stream timed with the Republican National Convention that would be political talk and music and comedy. And again, people were like, are you crazy? You're putting out a second channel of programming, a second channel of live programming from another studio, so that people don't even have to listen to FMU Live at all anymore? They can just listen to that other thing? And I said, yeah, that's what we're doing. And what in fact happened when we put together our first secondary channel is we did see the audience to WFMU proper drop very slightly, but it was way more than compensated by the audience that was listening to the second stream. A couple of years ago, we started another online media experiment, which was allowing people to comment on programs while they were in progress. So now most of the programs on WFMU have a concurrent chat board running next to them at all times. And this was perhaps the hardest thing for people to deal with, because it was creating a social situation based around the radio program, but something that the DJ couldn't entirely be in charge of. So it was similar to having a room full of people listening to your radio show while you're doing your radio show, and they might start talking about other things. And some of our DJs actually got very upset that all the attention wasn't being focused back on the DJ, that people were talking about the music that they were playing, but they were also talking about things that were completely unrelated. And to this day, this is still a problem that people are grappling with. On the other hand, the chat room seems to work better than an old message board that we had, because there is a de facto understanding that for this chat room, it only lasts anywhere from 1 hour to 3 hours, the duration of the radio program, and then it's over. And it's also understood that it is the DJ's space, yet we continue to have problems with people, with my staff members that is, accepting the idea that they are not the oracle at the, at the top of the food chain, and that there are people enjoying the radio program, but they're talking to each other, and they're not just talking about the radio program, they're talking about all sorts of other things. What some of our DJs have also started doing with the playlist chat room is they're also putting together, and I do this myself on my own program, is they also put together a stream of photographs that unfolds throughout the program. And what I started noticing a couple of months ago is that I had people who were going to my playlist page who weren't even listening. They were going to my playlist page and they were participating in the comment thread that was going on, and they were looking at the pictures and they were commenting on the pictures, but because their firewall at work was preventing them from listening, they just weren't listening. So I didn't even know what to call these people. They're not radio listeners. They're viewers of some sort. I'm not quite sure what they are. But they come to the page every week while the radio program is in progress. And we're now trying to build out the next version of our playlist comment thread. Throughout all these experiments that we did with online media and social media, it was pretty clear that they were all based around radio. And I made passing comment to a message board that WFMU had at one point, and that was a grand failed experiment because we didn't have anybody in charge of it. It was very much like the radio chat room that I talked about at the beginning, and it very quickly got out of hand. And also, I had not yet accepted in my own mind the fact that the message board was for the listeners, and it wasn't really for the radio station. So we canceled that, and instead we set up a blog, which we still have, called WFMU's Beware the Blog. And when I set up the blog, the purpose of it really, in my mind, was to attract more listeners. I was still in the radio mentality, thinking that all this online stuff that we're doing should really just be attracting more listeners. It should be a delivery mechanism. And very quickly, after we set up the blog, we saw that the traffic that the blog was generating was far outstripping any traffic that we had ever achieved through WFMU proper. And we would occasionally get a viral hit on the blog where we would see our traffic jump up to 100,000 page views a day. And on days like that, I would quickly run over to look at our streams to see how much our stream traffic had increased. And I was amazed when I saw it didn't increase at all. It didn't budge. We would be getting 100,000 page views a day on a certain article on the blog, and the same people who were listening to the radio station were listening before. And we had kind of these two parallel things going on. And one time we had a huge viral hit happening on the blog, and in fact, I think Technorati had us as the top viewed page for a day or two there on the entire blogosphere. And it was interesting because I was following the threaded comments on that viral article, which was just about some hideous skin disease that one of our DJ's friends had in Romania. And it managed to attract the attention of the worldwide dermatological community. And the guy actually ended up getting a lot of help, and there actually ended up being a documentary on the Discovery Channel in the UK about it. But for a couple of days there, we had the most viewed page on the blogosphere, and I was looking at the threads, I was looking at the threaded comments on that article, and there was a discussion going on between two people, said, "What is this site anyway?" Meaning our blog. Said, "Oh, it's a radio station. I just tuned in, and you know what? They're not talking about this article at all. They're asking for money." It was during our annual fundraiser. So on one hand, the people on the blog page thought that there would be something tying the two things together, but there wasn't. And meanwhile, the people on the radio station who were trying to raise money for another year of operation were totally oblivious to the fact that for 2 days there, we had the most viewed page on the blogosphere. So there's a complete disconnect. So my plan that we would have a blog and we would try to use it to generate traffic, and at least some of the traffic would come to the radio station in forms of listeners, that was an utter failure. But I quickly realized that it didn't even matter, because in the same way that we have people who come to our playlist pages just to look at the pictures unfold and just to participate socially in the chat that is ostensibly based around a radio program, we had people who were coming to the blog, they were becoming daily visitors to the blog, and they were developing a devotion to WFMU. But it wasn't radio exactly. But when it did come time to raise money once a year, we were finding that some of the people who were exclusively blog readers were donating to the station. At the time that all this was happening, we were starting to get enmeshed in the rights issues, the copyright issues, and the issues going on with the Record Industry Association of America and its enforcement arm Sound Exchange. So the experience that I had in some of the early negotiations on that led us to start up another entity, which for the first time was meant to take us away from radio entirely, and that's called the Free Music Archive. And we just launched it a couple of months ago. It's called freemusicarchive.org, although it is still in its pre-functional stage because we had a grant deadline. We had to launch it, so it is launched, it is up. But it's not yet really in its fully functional stage. A lot of the social aspects of it have not been built out yet. So the Free Music Archive and the blog are both parts of WFMU. but they're not intended to really drive listeners to the radio station. They're just intended to bring people to our community and to bring them, to make them part of this overall community that we previously had only used radio for, but now we're using online media for as well. And the Free Music Archive and the blog both play by very different rules, which I'll talk more about in a second. But one of the big reasons that we've survived, I think, the way we have, is that public radio and community radio both established, without realizing it a long time ago, a gift model or a charitable business model, which in fact started in Seattle in the early 60s at radio station KRAB, which was set up by Lorenzo Milam, who was kind of the granddaddy of community radio in the US. And what that has said for public radio and community radio, which is that you try to attract as many listeners as you can, and you understand that over 93% of them are never going to give you a dime. 93% of them are going to be freeloaders or deadbeats or any other number of derogatory terms that radio stations use internally to describe the people who listen but never donate. And I don't think that anybody in public radio or community radio really thought about the fact that they had a gift economy going on, but that's really what it is. And now that there's more attention going on to this notion of free, like the new book out called Free, but this is what we've done all along at WFMU. We've always just tried to do whatever we could to get as many listeners as we can get without compromising our philosophy of programming, and understand that the more listeners we have, the more donors we will get, understanding that way over 90% of our listeners are never going to give us a penny. And that's the same approach that we've taken to the internet. So the idea that we've had on the internet is just to not put any hurdles in people's way, to not require any registration, to not put pop-up ads, to not put audio insert ads that play before a stream starts, to just eliminate as many hurdles as we can, just so that we get as many listeners as we can, understanding that 93% of them will never give us a penny, but the more listeners we have, the more donors we will have. So we give it all away for free, and we count on a small percentage of people to donate enough to keep it going. And that pretty much has been working. Unfortunately, the problem is that broadcasting on the internet, engaging in social media, is so much more expensive than radio, where there's almost literally a ticker going for every person who's logged onto your stream, or every person who's downloading a podcast or listening to a streaming archive. That even though our income and our charitable giving has increased dramatically, the cost of operating as an online entity is far outstripping that, which is why we're still having financial problems. And I think it's why a lot of public and community radio stations are still having so much trouble engaging in this new field, because it's just much more complicated and it's much more expensive than radio ever was. One of the things we're working on at WFMU now is building a booster antenna in New York City. And I was actually working on that just yesterday, and I was struck, because these days most of my efforts as the manager of the station are focused on online endeavors, the iPhone app, for example. But yesterday we were trying to get this booster antenna up, and it just reminded me what ancient technology radio is, where I was dealing with hose clamps and hacksaws and PVC piping. I felt like we were building a submarine or a steam engine or something. But radio is much more cost-effective than online media. But I think another reason that radio is having so much trouble making the transition to online media is that radio overall, at least in the United States, long ago abandoned what its greatest strength was, which was to be a curator, to be a filter. If you go back to the 60s and 70s, and the heyday of progressive or underground radio in the US, radio stations became local entities. Each station had a unique personality, but that was abandoned a long time ago. And unfortunately, that's the type of thing that works the best on the internet. So radio stations long ago, for the most part, radio stations long ago abandoned the local organic entity curatorial approach for the bland, nationalized voice tracking approach. And that makes it very, very hard to succeed on the internet. It would have been radio stations would have been much, much better situated to survive in a new media landscape if they had continued to allow themselves to take on a distinct local personality for each station like they once did. These days, if you, somebody on the radio and internet newsletter site last week or the week before pointed out that if you Google the term internet radio, you will not see a single radio station listed until you get to, I don't know, the 25th or 26th page. Radio stations have been some of the slowest entities to engage in internet radio, and that's because most of them, if they're doing anything, they're only viewing it as a delivery mechanism, and they're not seeing it as an entirely new form of media. And in fact, online media is so much more powerful than radio, there's just no equivalence. When I was talking about that, I was talking about the viral article that we had about the skin disease. If that had been discussed on the radio, it would have gone, even if it had been on a program that had been made available on demand, that would have gone out there and then it just would have disappeared. But the fact that it appeared as a blog article meant that all these people who were interested in that were able to point to it, relink it, it appeared on search engines. So the power of online media astounds me, which is why I've often felt that one of the biggest problems we have is that we are a radio station and that we have to remain invested in our back history of 50 years as a radio station, because there is no comparison in the power of online media to the power of radio. As all these experiments that I'm describing here were happening, concurrently the recording industry has been going down the tubes. You can point to any number of different reasons for it, but there's no question about it that the recording industry is dying. And the Digital Millennium Copyright Act in 1998 in the United States was a situation where the record industry lobbyists got to Washington, D.C. before anybody else did, before anybody really understood what was happening, and they managed to pass the Digital Millennium Copyright, or they managed to get Congress to pass the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which made it a federal crime in the U.S. to do such basic radio things as playing a full set of the same artist. A Led Zeppelin 4-pack, for example, or announcing ahead of time that what you're going to play, such as now a new track from the new Radiohead album, actually against federal law in the United States due to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. I was involved in the negotiations with the record industry in 2003 in trying to come up with some kind of equitable rate that non-commercial and college and community radio stations would have to pay. And it was really one of the most depressing exercises I've ever been involved with in my life, because even back in 2003, it was quite clear to me that the record industry and their enforcement arm, Sound Exchange, were not interested in coming up with a reasonable royalty rate. And no, I don't think anybody can argue that a reasonable rate would be perfectly fine to live with. They were trying to use, in my opinion, the idea of rates as a way of narrowing the group of entities that would be able to afford to stream music over the internet. And they weren't so bothered with non-commercial radio because they saw non-commercial radio as very, very tiny players. And as long as they could establish a structure that kept radio stations very, very small, meaning that they could pay some kind of reasonable rate up to a certain threshold of audience, and above that audience it became exorbitantly expensive, they were happy with that. And that, in fact, is what has happened. But after that experience in 2003, I started focusing a lot more effort at WFMU in trying to do direct and alternative licensing, such as Creative Commons licensing, and getting waivers from record labels and artists that allowed us to do the same thing that we had done prior to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It was a very odd moment, because it was as if 1 minute ago the record labels were plying radio stations with vacations, drugs, Cadillacs, prostitutes to get them to play their music, and now they were suddenly saying that instead of them paying radio stations, they wanted radio stations to pay them. And after decades and decades of payola, and why does payola exist if not to get the records played on the radio, to ostensibly sell more records? After decades of that, the record industry was saying, promotional value to radio airplay? I've never heard of such a thing. And yet that is what happened, and it seemed to happen overnight in the blink of an eye. One of the things we did at WFMU is we went to the record labels and the artists that we were most friendly with, and we started getting waivers from them, getting permission to not only not have to pay the royalties that were being requested, but also the ability to ignore some of the regulations that I just alluded to, such as not being able to introduce a song ahead of time, not being able to play an entire set of the same artist, not being able to play more than 3 or 4 tracks from the same boxed set in the same set of music. So we've twice now gone for waivers, and we've gotten about 700 waivers from record labels and independent artists who simply want the exposure because they, I think, do understand that there is still promotional value of radio stations, especially non-commercial radio stations playing their music, because non-commercial radio stations, public, college, community radio, have broken many, many artists that commercial radio stations and commercial television outlets have taken decades to catch on to. But that experience made it clear to me that there was a need for a curated library of music that went much, much further than what we had been doing, because the waivers that we were getting really pertained to standard radio play. So that was when we started trying to set up the Free Music Archive, which was a free online library of music that is available for download and streaming for free non-commercial purposes, which, as I said, has been launched, and it's at freemusicarchive.org. And it's certainly not a new idea to have a pod-safe library. There are tons of pod-safe libraries out there, archive.org being one, Jamendo, Creative Commons being others. But one of the problems, as I started looking at it, one of the problems I saw was that while there's tons of music available on the internet for free, both legally and illegally, one of the things that's lost on the internet is the role that radio stations have performed, which is to take a curatorial approach, to have a radio station like we once had independent record stores, where you could go into an independent record store and record collectors would be happy to buy a record even if they had never heard of the artist or the label, simply because they trusted the taste of the buyer of the independent record store. Radio stations have played the same role, and that's the type of curatorial approach that I think has gotten lost with music on the internet. And that's what we're trying to correct with the Free Music Archive, or at least provide an alternative to with the Free Music Archive, where we're trying to take the alternative licensing approach heralded by Creative Commons, for example, and bring it to different communities, bring it to the music community, bring it to the radio community, who in general are not aware at all of alternative licensing mechanisms. Radio stations have in general had a very free ride in terms of licensing issues, because there has been no performance royalty ever applied to terrestrial radio. When it was applied to webcasting, it really threw people for a loop. So radio stations, record labels, or independent record labels, independent musicians are totally new to the idea of alternative copyright schemes and things like Creative Commons. So what we're trying to do is take that approach and bring it outside of the legalistic community, where it's very well known, and out of the academic community where it's very well known, and bring it to the music community. So the Free Music Archive is a curated library that's based on curators, based on radio stations that have done a good job as curators, or music festivals, or individuals, or clubs, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how the Free Music Archive is structured. And we also found very early on with the Free Music Archive that Creative Commons licenses would not be sufficient for that, because Creative Commons licenses work very well for individual musicians, a laptop musician, for example, or a folk musician who accompanies his or her own music on the guitar. As soon as you get an ensemble in order, as soon as there's 4 or 5 people in a band, and then when you throw a record label into the mix, and then you throw a publishing company into the mix, and you start getting into all the different rights associated with a single work of music, Creative Commons becomes much more unwieldy to deal with. And what we found with the Free Music Archive is that when we started it, we wanted to exclusively use Creative Commons licenses, but we very quickly learned that Creative Commons licenses were inappropriate for the more established artists and for the more established record labels. And we had to come up with other alternative types of licenses. So not only have we used Creative Commons licenses, but we're also using our own license, what we call internally the Free Music Archive license. We're also trying to do things with public domain material and breathe new life into public domain material. The Free Music Archive, the difference between the Free Music Archive license that we have and the Creative Commons license is that the problems that a lot of established artists have with the Creative Commons license is that it's irrevocable. That once you sign the Creative Commons license, it's out, and you can't a year later say, I've changed my mind. I don't want that piece of music to be available for free non-commercial use any longer. So the irrevocability of the Creative Commons license is a big problem for more established artists. And also the fact that a Creative Commons license will generally confer onto anybody who downloads that material. So it's not only legal for us to make a piece of Creative Commons music available on our Free Music Archive site, it's then legal for anybody else to do the same thing. So those are the two aspects of the Creative Commons license that we ran into problems with once we started taking this concept, a beautiful concept, Creative Commons, and applying it to commerce communities, such as the music industry, who up to then really had not had any experience with it. So the Free Music Archive is one type of non-radio site that we've been experimenting with, and I mentioned the blog, and I wanted to point out that the blog and the Free Music Archive both offer music for free, and they take completely different legal approaches, and I think it's necessary for them to take completely different legal approaches. What we do on the blog is we don't get permission to put music on the blog. We have an internal, non-written policy that simply says that we're not going to put music on the blog that people are trying to sell. It's pretty simple. That if there's music out there that's in print, that somebody's actively trying to sell, we're going to respect the fact that they're trying to sell it, and we're not going to make it available for free. So we're trying to focus, we're trying to only publish music on our blog that has pretty much been forgotten or orphaned. And 99.9% of the time, when the rights holders of that material find it on the blog, they're thrilled. They're happy that somebody remembered this record that came out 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 10 years ago, and that there's still interest in it. And I think that if we tried to take the fully legalistic approach that we're taking on the Free Music Archive and we tried to put that on the blog would be a failure. The blogosphere is still the Wild West legally, and you'll find blogs putting up anything and everything. And I still don't understand why there's so much legal action against peer-to-peer sites, but almost no legal action, if any legal action in the US against blogs. Because blogs are putting up tons and tons of music that is in print, currently commercially available, that the rights holders are actively trying to sell. And yet there's no attempt to prosecute or even prevent that from happening. So we kind of take what we'd like to think of as a somewhat ethical stance on the blog, where we're just trying to determine whether a piece of music is currently in print and whether there's anybody out there trying to sell it, and if so, we don't put it on the blog. We set up the Free Music Archive so that we could have an online library almost as self-defense, so that if the rights issues that I've been alluding to really got out of hand, that we would have a library of music that we could program out of, that we could actually do an entire show out of, or an entire week of programming out of, that the record industry and Sound Exchange wouldn't be able to touch. However, what's happened recently is that my experience from the 2003 negotiations is that it's clear that the record industry really doesn't care so much about public radio and community radio and college radio. They're really much more concerned with the Pandoras of the world, and less so than NPR. And they have struck a couple of deals that WFMU is now covered by, which, as I saw the handwriting on the wall, it has come to be that it's a very good deal, except for the fact that we're not protected as soon as we exceed a very, very small audience size. So as soon as you exceed about an average of 230 listeners at the same time, 24 hours a day, then your rates get exorbitant. So as long as you have no listeners, or virtually no listeners, you're fine. As soon as you develop even a moderate audience, your rates become so exorbitant that they become pretty much unaffordable. We just went through our first reporting period a couple of weeks ago because this deal was just struck a couple of months ago. And one of the things that radio stations in the US have to do now for the first time ever is we have to, 4 times a year, we have to report every piece of music that we play for a 2-week period. So we just a few months ago went through our first 2-week reporting period. And I made the mistake of mentioning to one of my more experimental DJs that if he only played pieces of music or pieces of audio that were 29 seconds or less, that he didn't have to do anything. He didn't have to write down a single thing. So he said, great. So he brought in his Mac, which he DJs from, and he opened up iTunes, and instead of sorting his iTunes library by song title or artist title, he sorted it by duration. And for the first 10 minutes of his show, he only played audio clips that had a duration of 0 seconds. So it was like a doorbell, a car horn. But he had so many items like that it lasted 10 minutes. And then once the 10 minutes were up of the 0-second tracks, he then played everything that had a duration of 1 second. By the end of 3 hours, he was up to audio pieces that had a duration of 18 seconds. And he was very happy. I was happy that we had found a way around the onerous reporting requirement, because a lot of my DJs would prefer to simply do a radio show and not have to worry about typing in everything they're playing as they're playing it. I made the mistake of tweeting what he was doing while he was doing it. And then Kenny, the DJ, made the mistake of writing on his playlist as the title of his show that day, I'm only playing things less than 30 seconds so I don't have to keep a damn RIAA playlist. That was the name of his show that day. Well, sure enough, a couple of weeks later, I got something resembling a cease and desist letter from Sound Exchange telling me that we had violated all the rules, and would we please take down the text on our website that said, I'm not playing anything longer than 30 seconds today, so I don't have to keep a damn RIAA playlist. So Sound Exchange was actually asking me to take down text from my website, which we thought was unprecedented. I ran to my lawyer with my tail between my legs and said, I thought there was a 30-second exemption. You told me that there was a 30-second exemption, and now RIAA and Sound Exchange is denying that a 30-second exemption exists. He looked it up. He actually sent me back the text and said, yes, indeed, there is a 30-second exemption. But it turned out that the 30-second exemption was kind of a gray area. The 30-second exemption was intended to pertain to news and informational programming where you're just using the music as a bumper or just as a transition or interstitial music. It's not meant to be the be-all and end-all of the program. So here we had a crazy DJ who took these tiny audio clips and created a 3-hour radio show out of it. It was unclear. It was unclear what the rule was, and it's still unclear. So we just took down the line about the damn RIAA playlist, and then they seemed relatively happy. But these are some of the issues that we're going through at WFMU, and our experiments continue. And I think that after we get our booster on the air in New York City, I do think that we will briefly see that we'll have more FM listeners than online listeners again, although I'm sure that the trend is going to continue. And we will eventually see that we are much more of an online entity than ever. And hopefully we'll be able to keep playing whatever music we want to play and not have to rely on our secret weapon of the Free Music Archive and start having to program only music that we've actually directly licensed through all these alternative licensing schemes. I see that I now have only about 10 minutes left, so I just wanted to open it up for any questions that anybody had. Back there?
Why are the RIAs such a bunch of dicks?
Okay, why are the RIAA such a bunch of dicks? Because, I'll just give you my opinion. And it's economics, I think. The record industry had created an empire, and the internet has destroyed their empire. And they're just trying to do whatever they can to preserve it. I think there's no question that they're seeing everything that they built up and all the money and power that they built up over decades just disappear. And they're just grasping for any revenue stream they can possibly get. And one of the revenue streams that they're going for is licensing from webcasting. And now they're trying to go for a performance royalty from terrestrial radio and television as well. And in fact, the US is one of the only countries in the world that doesn't have a performance royalty for terrestrial radio and television. And I don't have a problem with there being one. It's just a question of whether it's a reasonable rate or an unreasonable rate. And unfortunately, what they've been going for all along have been very, very unreasonable rates. And if you start looking at it at all, you see that it's far more than them simply trying to get a revenue stream, because you can't get a revenue stream out of a company that you've driven out of business. And what they're trying to do is drive companies out of business so that there's a much smaller pool of broadcasters in the digital sphere. Over here?
So recently they went after Pandora and WFMU, some bigger internet radio streamers, and I listened to Pandora, and there was sort of this all call to say we're about to go out of business, and then it turned out that the rate was reduced that Pandora and others had to pay. Why did the record industry give in to that, or what was their fear? Why did they yield?
I don't think they really yielded, to tell you the truth. The press that deal got was very, very skewed towards the record industry. The record industry didn't yield. If you look at the deal that was just struck between the record industry and Pandora, the minimum rate that Pandora has to pay is 25% of revenue. That's the minimum. 25% of revenue for using the music that they're playing. And probably it goes much, much higher than 25%. So Pandora is a company that, last I heard, had $40 million of annual revenue. So they're talking about paying $10 million, a minimum of $10 million of that. I'm not so sure that Pandora can actually survive that, companies that size. So Sound Exchange came down a little bit from their utterly ridiculous initial proposal, but I still don't see how a company like Pandora will be able to survive in the long run, paying a minimum licensing rate of 25% of revenue. And it'll actually probably be much higher than 25% of revenue, because if they exceed a certain, I think the way it works is that if they exceed a certain audience level, then they have to pay per performance, meaning per song, per listener. They have to pay a certain amount of money every time a single listener listens to a single song, whatever a song is. And that hasn't been defined, whether a Beethoven symphony is a song or a 13-second soundbite is a song. So I think that after years and years of fighting, companies like Pandora and Sound Exchange, they finally hit a deal that was mildly better for streamers than what they had thought, but I still don't think it's a survivable deal. And if you look at that deal and you compare it to what the public radio deal was in the United States, you realize on the surface what a great deal public radio got, because a company like Pandora might have to pay $10 million a year as a minimum at their current size, whereas all the hundreds of non-commercial radio stations in the US have to pay $1.85 million for like a 3-year period. So you can see the importance that the record industry puts on a company like Pandora versus all the public community and college radio stations in the entire US. They don't see it as the same way. The one hidden part of that deal for public radio is that only counts as long as they have no listeners, as long as their average listenership remains below 230 people at a time. Over here?
I was really struck by your comments around creating kind of identity, as opposed to just being, anything. And one of the radio stations I've been listening to on iTunes a lot is Secret Agent Radio.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always wondered how, which mixes together actually clips from James Bond movies and other movies of that genre into the
Choose on what service?
Choose from iTunes the radio service?
Oh, from iTunes Radio? That's a good question. WFMU's stream got picked up on iTunes early on, and I've been asked about 36 times, how did you get your stream on iTunes? And I don't know. And I've gone knocking on the Apple wall, saying like, hello, it's like, and I have no idea. I have no idea who picked us, who keeps us there, and we just added our first app to the iTunes store too, and that was an Orwellian experience, boy, getting our app in there, and that took months and paperwork and hurdles, and so I have no idea who at Apple chooses which radio stations to stream, and I'm just glad we're one of them.
Hey, my name is Scott, a long-time listener, first-time caller. So one of the things that strikes me about WFMU is that you have this brand or this radio station, but that within each of the shows, I mean, there's just an incredible diversity. I mean, it's truly free form. And so I'm interested for you to talk about some of the techniques that the individual DJs might employ to build their own individual brand within WFMU to get listenership.
That's a great question. I can't possibly answer it, especially because of technology now. In the pre-internet days and pre-digital days, everybody came in and played records. Now every DJ does their show completely differently. Some DJs do their entire show from a laptop. Some DJs come in and play only 45 RPM records. Some people are streaming YouTube videos and airing that. Some people talk nonstop. Some people walk around New York City after they get off work and just record themselves and interview people on the street, and then they air that. So it's very complicated now. And we have about 55 regular DJs, and there's probably about 10 or 15 different overall approaches. Probably the most common one, though, is probably people who play some CDs, play some vinyl, and play some MP3s. Some of the MP3s from our internal library, as well as stuff that they're streaming and downloading on the web. But there's so many different approaches now that it's really hard to keep track. And it's really interesting, actually, now to walk into the studio and for me to see how each DJ is doing their show. We actually talked about trying to do a video podcast of that, because there's also, just in terms of the digital DJs, there's probably about 5 or 6 different programs that our digital DJs are using. Some use Ableton Live, some use Serato, some are using Tractor, all these different digital DJing programs. So there's not a single approach by any means. There's way more than a dozen approaches.
I love the show. I can't believe I got through. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about a lot of the things that happen where the participatory nature of the web is kind of bled into the radio programming, things like remix contests and stuff. I don't know if you might want to tell an anecdote or two of times where the kind of participatory dynamic of the web has seemed to kind of change the nature of the radio programming and what actually gets on the radio.
Yeah, I did talk about how the fact that we often, our online experiments have a parallel life to the radio station, but it also does happen that sometimes something on the blog interacts really perfectly with the web, and sometimes it's even legal. That's really great. So one of our DJs one time had a soundbite, the DJ known as Kenny G, as opposed to the soprano sax player known as Kenny G. He had a soundbite that he would play every week by a New York performance artist ranting and raving about how much he loved cake, and how he goes into every cake store in New York City and demands the cake until the cake store kicks him out of the store. It's about a 30-second rant. And Kenny, one week on the air, just totally spontaneously played it and said, does anybody want to remix this? And then, in fact, he took the MP3 and he put it on the blog. And before the end of the show, this was all totally spontaneous, before the end of the show, people started remixing it and sending it back to him, and he was playing them on the air. And the performance artist who did it called in. He was thrilled with the whole thing. And then I think Kenny eventually got 6 hours of remixes of that little cake poem or rant or whatever you want to call it. And that was just a great spontaneous moment when the blog and the radio station interacted perfectly. And that's happened a couple of times.
I don't know if this is a question, it's a comment, but well, there's a question in there somewhere. I was really struck by how you described how the DJs kind of were totally taken aback by this concept that there's this chat going on and there's people talking large lecture situations in particular.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about, what are some ways that some of them either got over it or perhaps they haven't?
Well, the way I got over it, because I noticed before I started talking today that this talk was being streamed, and I noticed that there was a little chat board next to where I was appearing, I closed the damn thing. I'm not gonna stand up here talking and watching people, insulting me and making fun of me, and forget that. I'll look at that later. So in fact, that's what I do when I'm on the air too. When I do my music show, I can take being insulted. So if I'm talking, I shut it down. I won't even look at it. But we still do have the problem where some of the DJs don't have a thick skin enough, and they don't like the fact that that some of the comments that come in are negative. And online media, social media, tends to bring out a lot of nastiness. So you have to kind of accept that. But I do think that it's easy to just shut it down and not look at it if it's becoming a problem. But I find it refreshing, actually, to get the negative comments because they're put in context. And if you see a ratio of 20 positive to 1 negative, then the negative ones don't even bother me at all anymore. We're almost out of time. Any, like 1 or 2 more questions? Back there?
Yeah, actually, this question came from a colleague who sent over Twitter watching the stream. And it was more towards the audience here in education. And you were talking about the radio and music empire. And he asked, could higher ed be viewed too as an empire then, by the way you were describing it? So I thought I'd throw that out to the group. Anyone want to rail with Dave?
Well, it's funny because earlier you talked about when you were talker, you let people talk. And how that experiment for you has demonstrated that there's a reason the radio people are there. So I think there's a little bit of give and take with some of that. It's kind of interesting to hear that.
But I've actually wanted to try the radio chat room again, but have a blog, have some kind of online component to it. And I think it would be completely different. Because the way we tried it in the past, it was a radio program that appeared, that listeners had free reign on, but when it was over, there was no way for them to communicate with each other. So I do want to try that again, but have some kind of online forum so that for the other 167 hours of the week, they can talk to each other and maybe perhaps plan it out. Maybe take turns over who's a moderator and who's not. And I think it would probably work out a lot better that way. Last question?
Sort of following up on Scott's question, when you have a group of individuals and you're allowing them a lot of freedom to pursue their passions and what they're going to do, do you have any kind of overarching vision or anything that you share with your DJs to say this is our overall brand and how we want to come together or what direction?
Not really. FMU is incredibly lucky in that we have such a well-defined community and such a long-running tradition that we haven't had to lay that down. And it's a community radio station in the sense that the programmers come out of the community of listeners. So nobody gets on the air or starts programming or doing development or online media for us unless they've already come through the community of listeners. So we're very, very lucky in that we haven't had to have a lot of written rules, and we do have norms, we do have internal norms, which generally nobody looks at and pays any attention to. But I guess we're much luckier than most anarchic organizations in that way. It's kind of self-regulating. There's a lot of self-regulation that goes on.
I'm not thinking of it as one of the rules, but sort of that, that long-range vision or just overall, I guess it's really about community and about your listeners and I think that. And then whatever that looks like is fine. Respecting the diversity.
It's a hard question to answer. There's a lot of internal dialogue that goes on FMU as well. Listservs and internal listservs and discussion that goes on there, but it's mostly a pretty self-regulating entity. All right, well, thank you. One last question over here.
organizations had a curatorial role and a curatorial approach. And then there was a comment about higher education. It just occurred to me that that idea of the curatorial approach and your audience learning who it is that you are, what it is that you're about, what your values and analytical methodologies are, could apply to faculty individually and collectively in higher education. Because I think I've worked in distance learning for about 15 years, and one of the most difficult things to do is to help faculty understand that they're not an endangered species. But I just toss that out as an idea because it occurs to me the more you talked, the more I saw that same, and her question, you know, this is an evolving thing, and it has to do with the value brought to whatever materials and the ability for people to access them and move toward the value, the format, whatever works for them. I really appreciate your comments very much.
No, thank you. And thanks, everybody.
Yeah, I just want to say,